Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, good morning.
Yes, we can. Good morning.
Sorry for the delay, but I had a commitment. Okay, we shall start today by discussing, I would say, the most general and important decision support system or model for support to decision making. And this model is called the multi-criteria analysis. So it is a way of formalizing all the approaches that we have discussed and proposed during last lectures. So this is a prototypical model for decision making, but it is derived from decision theories and that help the policymakers in assembling decision support system that may sustain their decision or give relevance to their activity of decision. The idea of multi-criteria methods starts from the assumption that we pass from a single goal perspective to a many goals perspective. So this is a classical method of analysis, but it is employed to solve managerial decision problems, and it is generally based on a linear or single criterion optimization with the perspective of obtaining a fully rational and constructed decision support system. An example, we may want to evaluate two different processes for electricity production, having, for example, as limit emissions of pollutants and the availability of fuel. So we have two criteria, pollutant emissions and availability of fuel. In general, this criteria may be expressed with a function to maximize, for example, maximal energetic efficiency. So a function of energetic efficiency we may indicate with the letter X that shall be maximized. And in this process of maximization, there are some constraints that represents the limits to emission of pollutants. And for example, we may include as constraints a first one in which we limit the quantity of coal used. And for example, we may say that the quantity of coal used shall always be less than the quantity of coal available. We may apply the same criteria for other fuels, for example, for methane. And then the third criterion, taking into account the limit to emissions, may be implemented by employing the tables, figures or tablet values that are provided by laws, like for example in the 152 2006, we have tables of limit to emissions, and these tables may be formalized into limitation that shall go into the multi-criteria method. So in a complex evaluation, we would like to employ linear optimization, but most of times linear optimization is seen to be too rigid. It is not always possible to identify a single objective. So even if you would like to have a decision process that is structured, we may not be able to do that, but because there are more than one objective. More difficult is the case in which we cannot quantify the various criteria. Not always constraints are made explicit, so an effort shall be made by the decisor, in this case the environmental engineer that is charged of sustaining the policymaker in his decision. And in general, we may say that the reality is not perfectly modeled, and this is a kind of base action for modeling efforts. What are the possible solutions? Use of nonlinear programming models that makes very complex and always based on a perfect quantification of the objectives, but it is not always possible. And the second one is the use of optimization models with several objectives. And this is exactly what multi-criteria analysis models do. Multi-criteria model starts from the assumption that if something is considered to be valid at all, then it should be valid for several reasons. Saying worthily, or in other terms, we may say that in general, in order to decide or to accept the validity of one option, we shall look for those options that are valid for several reasons. So we cannot only focus on one aspect, for example, the economic aspect or the environmental protection aspect. In general, these models are all based on the idea that in a complex decision problem, like it is the case in environmental impact assessment or strategic environmental appraisal, there may be many aspects and not all traceable to a single goal. And the effort shall be made, taking into consideration most of these aspects. What are the advantages? The advantages is that these models takes into account priorities and preferences, so it is implicitly a model that relies on participation, highlights the different components of the problem and their relationships, and may help in organizing and synthesizing this data in an organic way. So these models help in going toward the objective of the rationality of a decision, make explicit all the data processed. We are obliged, for example, in defining the criteria to make explicit what are the functions what we are taking into consideration. So this goes in the direction of transparency, and for the formalization of these decision processes into a well-structured model reduces the arbitrariness of the decision, so enhances its reproducibility. This means that several decisions shall come to the same decision employing a structured model for decision like it is the multi-criteria models. The disadvantages is that by this approach we might exaggerate some juxtapositions, so some concepts or criteria that are somehow linked in the multi-criteria analysis may be exaggerated by relevance, lends itself to manipulation, but this is characteristic of all models. Manipulation means changing the structure of the model in order to change the results. Simplifies the reality, and this is again a characteristic of all models. Some techniques may be very complex, but this should not be a problem for an engineer. Sometimes the process is even too transparent, so obliging the decision makers to put on the table of discussion even some issues that maybe are delicate and may have some kind of unpredictable consequences or outcomes. Why it is important in environmental impact assessment? Allow to synthesize a lot of information, take into account several objectives. So we are extending our decision model, uses arrays of assessment, that is a useful way to organize and communicate information. The decision is made closer to reality compared, for example, to the cost-benefit analysis that we shall discuss next week. That is, if you want, the first example of a decision support model, that is even now largely most used because we humans and we in human society like to think in monetary terms. So it is easily communicable the idea of evaluating costs and benefits and making an evaluation in these terms. How do this model works? The object of the analysis is broken down into simple factors, what we may call the criteria, which describe it exhaustively. These criteria are then analyzed separately, and then several alternatives to the project are then evaluated with respect to each single criterion of choice. So we start by breaking down the problem into several criteria. Then the criteria are analyzed separately and structured, and then the final step is to compare the different options or alternatives of implementing one project, applying the criteria just selected. For example, we start by analyzing the first option, let's say option A with respect to criterion C1, C2, and criterion C3. Then we analyze option B, again, based on criteria C1, C2, C3, and then we come, as it is customary, with a ranking of the possible alternative. The criteria are the means by which the various alternatives are compared to each other over the objective of the decision maker. Question: what is a criterion? A criterion is a real function f such that it is meaningful to compare two alternatives A and B to a set of alternatives A, to alternatives small a and lowercase b to a set of alternatives capital K A with respect to a particular point of view, solely on the basis of the value of a function of the criteria, but gives you an indicator for the different options. In practice, the criteria represent the environmental components, the cost or the social aspect, and so on. So the criteria are ways to formalize what up to now we have called environmental components, indicators for environmental components, or indicator for economic feasibility, or for social costs, and so on. So by this generalization, we may call into play to the multi-criteria models a series of aspects of a decision that may be of environmental type, of technical type, or socio-economic, or whatever. In general, this has to do with definitions of terms, criteria, and attributes, may be employed as synonym. In practice, the theory of operational research talk about multi-criteria analysis in the case in which the problem of choice is among a finite number of alternatives, or multi-objective analysis in case the decision problem presents inherently an infinite number of alternatives. In the practice of decision-making processes, these are also synonyms. How is the procedure to build up a multi-criteria analysis? Please note that this may be a question during the oral examination. What are the 5 main phases of a multi-criteria analysis model? The first one is the definition of evaluation matrix. The second is standardization of data representing the matrices. Then the assignment of weights. Finally, the calculation of sorting, so the ranking of alternatives. And finally, a sensitivity analysis. Evaluation matrix. So the core of my methodology. In the evaluation matrix, we build an n by m two-dimensional array with crosses the n objectives or criteria for selection of alternative with the m options of choice of the m alternatives, presenting so n by m indicators with different units of measurement that may be quantitative, qualitative, or even mixed. And we put this matrix, we start, building the multi-criteria analysis by constructing a matrix that will help us to evaluate the different alternatives with the criteria put forward. For example, in the table that I'm presenting here, the first criteria 1, maybe land in hectares. Criteria B may be the cost of a project, for example, in euros. Criteria 3 may be the impact on the landscape. In this example, I'm putting for criteria A, surface, land, hectares, impacted by the project. By criteria B, the costs, for example, millions of euros, 60, 40, 65. And criteria C, a non-quantitative but only qualitative criterion that tells us that landscape will get improved, the landscape will get worsened, or the landscape will get just slightly improved. So you immediately understand that by this kind of definition, we are mixing inside the same, into the same model, quantitative and qualitative evaluations. Quantitative, for example, land in hectares or euros, costs in euros. Qualitative, for example, aspect of the landscape. Please note that this is not the Leopold matrix, so this is not the matrix of impacts. I recall you that in case of a Leopold matrix, we compare different project alternatives with the possible impacts of the different environmental components. Here we are roughly trying to make a ranking or a selection of possible alternatives based on the various criteria of choice. The evaluation metric is not only served to identify the impacts, but also to organize the data possibly in a very complex way. Evaluation matrices consist of two-dimensional checklists, a list of activities, project, plan, or program, that is related with a list of components, environmental, social, and economic. The two-dimensional representation of a cause-effect relationship between planning, programming activities, and the social and environmental factors that are potentially subject to change as a consequence of the implementation of my project. For each intersection between the elements of the two lists, it is possible to verify the actual presence of the impact reported matrix and the possibly already give an assessment or evaluation matrix or the impact matrix and so on. So if you want, the Leopold matrix is a special case of evaluation matrix in which the criteria are solely environmental components, while the project activity, while the alternatives are essentially the project activities. Again, I say it worthily. The matrix of impacts, or the Leopold matrix, is a special case of an evaluation matrix in which I am evaluating different project activities compared to different effects of two different environmental components. There are several methods for the construction of evaluation matrix. You understand that this is the core of the problem. And while building the multi-criteria analysis, the core is that of building a consistent, complete as possible evaluation matrix. Methods are generally based on a hierarchical system. We start from generic elements, for example, environmental components or phases of a plan and so on, and we descend in detail with a kind of breakdown forward. Sometimes it is also possible to reason in the reverse way, so we use a reverse process, so a backward estimation coming from starting from where we want to go in terms of environmental protections, for example, and what are the actions, for example, or the alternatives that shall be considered and ranked in terms of environmental protection issue. Is often based on scientific literature and case studies. Typically, a matrix of impact may be disaggregated by, for example, temporal horizon. So we may consider different matrices in different stages of the development of a project, or maybe disaggregated spatially. So we may, for example, have multiple matrices referring to different areas of the ecosystem that may be impacted, and then they may also be disaggregated in terms of typologies of the actions and in terms of the actors responsible of carrying the actions. The second step, once I build an evaluation matrix, is that of the standardization. Standardization is needed to make data in the array homogeneous and operational. This is needed if we want to make any kind of calculation and come out with a result, a numerical result. The data are transformed into dimensionless values by convention, one or more logical mathematical functions. And there are two main types of standardization: the linear standardization, that is by far the most used and the most easy to manage, or the value function utility that requires instead a lot of more knowledge or competencies to be employed in order to standardize the criteria. This is an example of linear standardization. For example, simple linear standardization involves simple mathematical functions that operate on the value in each column of a matrix. I recall you the columns are the criteria and can vary from column to column of a matrix. Of course, its criteria may be standardized by appropriate mathematical function. Typically, in linear standardization, we may employ indicators like, for example, a rho maximum. So we may normalize the value of the criteria in the columns by normalizing by the maximum value of the criteria. We may employ an idea value, so we may have an indication of what might be the ideal value at which your implementation should point. We may employ an average value. Again, in this case, the normalization is made by dividing by the average value of the criteria. We may employ interval standardization. This is simply a way of converting the value of the criteria from its minimum to its maximum value into an interval in the range 0, 1, 0 minimum, 1 maximum. Of course, this function has an output of 0 and 1, and 0 if the value of the criteria is the minimum of the row, because here is 0, and 1 if the value of criteria is the maximum 1. In this case, of course, x max minus x min divided by x max minus x min, this gives 1. So the output is a value in the range 0, 1. And then there are several ways, like, for example, an additive constraint in which we normalize by the summation of value in the row, or we normalize by vector by dividing, for example, by the absolute value of a vector, so that is the square ratio of the square of the value of a criterion. In other cases, you may employ value utility functions for standardization. Value utility function assign to each indicator a value that is a corresponding score of merit, preference, or utility that is dimensionless, again in the interval 0, 1. Necessitates to define a function for each indicator, so each column, in this case, should be standardized by a specific value utility function. It is said value when the data are deterministic, utility when the data are random or stochastic. The utility measures the satisfaction of the decision maker. I give you here two examples. For example, an indicator whose value goes from a minimum to a max. We may have a linear way of converting this indicator in terms of standardization, or we may have a nonlinear way, or we may have even nonlinear way that are strictly specific for the indicator and criteria taken into account. For example, if we want to introduce, I want to standardize a criterion that links the quality of environment, or for example, of a water ecosystem, water body ecosystem, to, for example, the concentration of some element. In my idea, for example, if we evaluate the quality of ecosystems as a function of the concentration, for example, of dissolved phosphorus in the water column, we shall say that we will have a maximum quality when we do not have dissolved phosphorus. In the case phosphorus is considered to be the toxicant or the pollutant. This is the case, for example, for eutrophication, while the value for the criterion may be quickly decrease as the concentration of the pollutant increase. Of course, I've talked about phosphorus, but we may talk in general of any toxicant. We may identify a threshold value below which the criterion of quality of a water ecosystem is maximum, and above which the quality of ecosystem decreases quickly. Certain functions in the value utility function are derived in an objective way, for example, by laboratory tests. Typically, if you have followed the class of ecotoxicology, you may recall the dose response tests that are obtained by employing some target species or indicator species in order to evaluate what is the environmental or ecological damage of some polluting events. Other functions are necessarily subjective, for example, aesthetic value, social tolerance, and so on, and therefore are subject to change depending on the evaluator. So these are very subjective and are problematic to be implemented into a methodology, especially if you want to build a robust objective methodology. Also subject to some ambiguity. These latter are widely used in evaluation of sustainability, because not all the evaluators may agree on the relevance of certain aspects of a problem. The main difference between the two types of normalization is that in the first case, linear optimization, the function may, but need not, vary from column to column of a matrix. In the second case, you define a function for each indicator that is specific depending on the type of indicator. The third step, once you have normalized your criteria to the evaluation metric, is that of assigning the weights. What are weights? Weights are dimensionless numerical values or coefficients measures the priority of the various aspects or the various criteria of a problem, and never have absolute but only relative value, are the marginal rate of substitution between the various criteria. So, meaning that the weights are employed in order to decide or define which are the criteria that shall be taken more into account into finding the final sorting or ranking of alternative. For example, I may indicate for criteria 1 a value of 30, and for criteria 2 a value of 10. Therefore, we may say that criteria 1 weighs 3 times criteria 2, and this means that criteria 1 is 3 times more important or more relevant in producing the final output of the system than criteria 2. You understand, again, these are very subjective, and that in practice are the calibration knot of your decision model. You build a multi-criteria analysis by building an evaluation matrix of the basis of several criteria, and then when you start applying your model, you have the choice, the option of deciding which are the criteria that should be evaluated more or less according to the feeling of the evaluator, to the conditions in place, to the feeling of the population, to indication pertained by policymakers, and so on. The assignment of weights is made. There are 3 main classes of techniques for assignment of weights. Direct assignment is by large the most employed. When you do comparisons in pairs, this is more than that one. This criteria should be more important than that one. And then method based only on a ranking that may be also incomplete. By direct assignment, what is the easiest model and the one by far more employed, is the more ambiguous one, meaning that are really totally dependent on the feeling and on the knowledge and understanding of the decision maker. Weights are sometimes assigned directly based on a predetermined scale of scoring, so you may decide that you employ weights that range in the interval 1 to 100 or 1 to 1000 and so on, or redistributing the score among all the criteria so that the sum may be equal to a defined value, but maybe 100, 1000 and so on. So there is a way of these are the 3 ways for direct assignment of weights. Any questions? Sorry. I have a machine crash, sorry. Now it's working back again. Example of assignment of weights by comparisons in pairs. This is probably the most, besides the direct assignment, is the second most employed mechanisms or methodology. The criteria are compared on pairs, and a relative score is assigned. This builds a matrix of paired comparisons square and that is symmetrical about the main diagonal. The values of each row of the array are then aggregated to a final vector using function like a maximum eigenvector, least square, and so on. For example, we may decide that criteria B is twice more important than criteria A. This makes criteria B half important than criteria A, of course. Of course, on the diagonal, you have all ones, and the matrix is symmetric, anti-symmetric around the diagonal. For example, criteria C may be seen 7 times more relevant than criteria A. In this case, criteria C is 1/7 of criteria A. So here in the upper part of the matrix, you have the marginal value of substitution, and in the lower part of the matrix, you have the inverse of the marginal value of substitution. Interesting part is that you can end up with a final indicator for each criteria, in which, for example, you may employ a function that aggregates the marginal rate of substitutions for the different criteria. So this gives already a ranking of the different criteria in terms of marginal rate of substitution. By convention, the array elements are positive in the comparison by pairs. As I told you, in the upper diagonal part of the matrix, you have the inverse of the value in the lower diagonal part of the matrix. The diagonal values are always by definition equal to a unity. Consequently, if you make a calculation, the number of comparisons required is the number of criteria multiplied by the number of criteria minus 1 divided by 2. In this case, in which we have 3 criteria, 3 times 3 minus 1 is 6 divided 2. This means that we have to make 3 comparisons. And these are represented by this triangular matrix, upper part of the matrix of comparisons of criteria. Then, of the assignment of weights, there are methods also based only on a ranking that may be also incomplete. These methodologies are less common and very complex. There is no quantitative assessment, but only an order of importance. It is assumed that the sum of the weight is equal to 1. Then we have here 3 main approaches: the expected values, external values, and the random weights. In case of expected values, given the premise, it's assumed a distribution of values that is equally likely. In this case, average values are those that approximate satisfactorily the vector of weights. So the weights do not depend on the nature of the criteria or the preference of the decision maker, but only by the number and order. In the case of assignment of weights by external values, only the extreme weights are considered, and then by this you can calculate the resulting orders. All weights are related rankings included between these extremes and comply with the order of priority imposed. And then the random weights, it is generally a large number of random rankings, and all the possible combination of weights satisfying the initial assumptions are calculated. Of course, these are methodologies that require some kind of computational implementation. For example, we may calculate the population of all the pool of possible rankings by random assignment of weights, and then select only these combination of weights that are satisfying initial assumption. For each of these sets of weights, it is calculated the resulting ranking of alternatives and the probability for each ordering. The ordering is derived from a comparison of probabilities in this case. Then the third step after evaluation matrix, standardization, and weights assignment is that of calculation of ranking. Calculation of ranking, it is the output of a multi-criteria analysis model. The Bayesian mechanisms combine weights and standardized indicators for any alternative, and then compare alternatives to each other based on the values obtained. Again, here we have two main techniques, the weighted sum or the calculation of two indicators, the indices of concordance and the indicator of discordance. Again, by far the most employed one, the weighted sum. It is a prescriptive methodology or prescriptive technique based on transitivity, completeness of the ordering. It is extremely common and very simple. And in reality, again, this is the, as a matter of fact, is the most used methodology. Sometimes it is even too simple and can be unfaithful, especially in very complex situations. Each indicator is multiplied by the respective weight and summed with those of the same line. I will shortly give you some example with calculation. The second way is that of the indices of concordance and discordance. It is a descriptive technique depending on the assumption of incomparability and intransitivity. Remember what we have discussed on Monday concerning choice problem. Comparison in pairs of all alternatives by evaluating two different indices, index of concordance and the index of discordance. The index of concordance measures the satisfaction of choosing one alternative in respect to another one with respect to various criteria. So the concordance index tells us how much is the satisfaction in choosing one alternative compared to the choice of another alternative by employing the criteria that was indicated in the construction of evaluation matrix. In general, this is equal to the sum of the corresponding weights. So the concordance matrix, the concordance matrix is made up of cells in which there is a summation of the weights of the various criteria for which one alternative wants over the other. Then the second, the complementary matrix is the discordant matrix that measures the regret of dismissing one alternative comparing to another one, and it is usually measured as the maximum difference between the values of indicator of both criteria for which it is expressed the regret of choosing the second option than the first one. Usually, but not necessarily, this may be normalized to the maximum difference of columns. So, in the discordant matrix, we compare the differences of the values of the criteria for which one alternative loses compared to another one. You loses means it is less appropriate. And then you may normalize with differences, for example, by dividing by the maximum difference in the column. So you normalize. You will have one when the difference of the criteria is the maximum, and you will have value lower than one when the difference of the criteria will be less than the maximum one. By the construction of these two matrices, we may build two indices, the index of concordance and the index of discordance. The construction of two matrices of pairwise comparison, that of discordance and concordance. So this is a much more sophisticated way of building rankings of a possible alternative. In particular, we aggregate the values of the matrices of concordance and discordance into two vectors whose elements are the indices of concordance and the indices of discordance for the different alternatives obtained, but are obtained according to this formula. The index of concordance is simply the difference between the summation along the row and the summation along the columns of a matrix of concordance, while the index of discordance is obtained by the difference between the value, the summation of the row and the summation of the columns in the matrix of discordance. The alternatives were then sorted into two lists, a list of increasing index of concordance and a list of decreasing index of discordance. So somehow we are measuring here what is the positive effect of choosing one alternative compared to another one by evaluating the satisfaction for all the criteria you have introduced. It seems very theoretical, but I provided you an example of index of concordance and discordance. Let's us compare three alternatives, A1, A2, and A3, and with three criteria, C1, C2, C3, whose weights are then respectively 0.2, 0.3, and 0.5. This means that the criteria that it is considered more relevant in my choice is criteria number 3. And then I have my alternatives. This is the evaluation matrix, or if you want, the impact matrix, in particular case, if I am evaluating impacts. On the basis of this, I construct the concordance matrix by summing the weights for which one option wins. For example, let's look criteria C1. Option A1 wins according to criteria C1 over option A2. Option A1 loses according to criteria C2 over option A2, and option A2 wins against option A1 according to criteria 3. So wins criteria 1, loses criteria 2, wins again criteria 3. So the summation for comparison between A1 and A2 is exactly the summation of the weights. In the case of C1 is 0.3 and 0.5 makes 0.8. So 0.8 is the sum of the weights for which one alternative wins over the various criteria. The discordant matrix is slightly more complex. We have to calculate the maximum of the differences in columns for various criteria, and you obtain this value for the matrix. In general, take in mind that for the discordant matrix, you will have to normalize the difference of the values of the indicator with the maximum difference of the criteria. Do you remember? And classical standardization is that obtained by dividing by the maximum value, so that for using the value of the indicator in which the difference is maximum will appear in the discordant matrix with a 1. While for values for which the criteria will be less than the maximum will appear in the discordant matrix with values less than 1. So it is normalized with this of values of indicator with a maximum difference of a criteria indicator for both criteria of battle laws, and then it is chosen the maximum of these differences. Okay, this is a more the same example, but if you want to formalize more or explicitly, you have three alternatives, three criteria with three different weights. From this is the evaluation matrix. From this evaluation matrix, we construct the concordance matrix according to this algorithm, and the discordance matrix according to this algorithm. And from these matrices, we may calculate the concordance and the discordant indexes. But as I told you, are the sum. Let me go back. Concordance are sum of weight, discordance are the sum of the differences. Here you have the maximum differences for the different alternatives. So here you have a 1, because the maximum difference is a 1 according to criteria 1 when you choose alternative 1. This is the case of concordance matrix. This is the case of calculation for the discordance matrix. And then if we calculate the indexes of concordance and discordance by employing these algorithms with these formulas, we obtain a concordance vector that may allow us to rank the different alternatives, three alternatives in terms of concordance. And in terms of concordance, we see that A2 wins largely over A1 and A3. But in terms of concordance, we may not distinguish alternatives A1 and A3, while if we go in terms of discordance, then A2 wins in terms of discordance over all the other alternatives, while in the case of a discordance, we may also distinguish between alternative 1 and alternative 3, but meaning that if I choose alternative 3, I feel a larger discordance than if I choose alternative 1. So again, the solution is the less discordance, so alternative 2, but for those alternatives that may be somehow more discordant, we may also distinguish by employing the discordance vector. Just to tell you that we may become very sophisticated in the way we do the rankings. Same example, weighted sum again, alternative 2 wins against the other alternative in the example we have proposed. Again, we may standardize this value by the row maximum. So we divide values in the discordant matrices by the maximum value appearing in the column. Once we have produced these rankings according to discordance, concordance, or simply according by employing the weight, we may do a kind of sensitivity analysis that is particularly indicated in case of uncertainty and ensure a proper evaluation of all possible points of view of a problem. Sensitivity analysis is operated on the results to see what changes in the model of analysis can generate substantial differences in the performance of the alternatives. So the point of inversion, so is the point for which you are asking what values of the criteria and indicators are the point in which there is a reversal of the order of the alternatives in the ranking. Okay, how do we do sensitivity analysis? Is a classical standard methodology to manipulate mathematical models. We try to identify the most sensitive components of a model, but maybe parameters, weights, or criteria, but make significantly change the ranking. And how do we do that? You do that by calculating, computing the sensitivity of a condition number. That is a relative variation of indicator or of a state variable as a consequence of a relative variation in the parameter. There are three main types of sensitivity analysis. One is of the method, apply a different method of data standardization, for example, and when possible, computation of final scores is used to control the dependence of the results from the method of calculation. Or we may make sensitivity analysis on the criteria. So we may add or delete some decision criteria. It is used to check if basic criteria are missing, or we may make sensitivity analysis on the weights. It is the most used and change the ratings on certain criteria, so allow to notice the degree of influence of each factor on the final decision, and in particular, the importance of the subjectivity of the decision maker in assigning weights to different criteria. The sensitivity measures the sensitivity of alternatives X to criteria P. Again, it is always foreseen by implying of at least two levels of variation of the criteria, and then we shall determine more accurately the values of the more sensitive criteria. For the levels of variation are maybe foreseen for the most sensitive criteria. Okay, in practice, and we are finishing here, there are some models that are already available. These are validated models available on the market. SMART, but is simple multi-attribute ranking techniques, or AHP, that is an analytic hierarchy process, or the ideal value method. And these are prescriptive, while there are some descriptive methodologies and descriptive models like the Electra, Regime, EvaMix, and so on. These are all professional models, validated models to be employed for the multi-criteria analysis application. Software, a list of softwares you may use, InfoHarvest or Sovida software that employ multi-criteria analysis as we have described here, or we have decision support systems. In general, Definite, that is a decision support, a general decision support tool provided by the University of Utrecht, if I'm not wrong, WISP, or you may do GIS analysis and so on. These are references, and I stop my lecture here, asking if you have any question. Otherwise, we'll close the class and we will meet on next Tuesday with the cost-benefit analysis methodology. And please note that next week we will start discussing the problems to be assigned to each group for producing the case, the value, specific studies on the various aspects of the environmental impact assessment procedures. Okay, I stop here. If you have any question, otherwise we close.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.